The past comes into the present when you go on a tour of the huts of the Bogong High Plains. There are over 150 huts in the Australian Alps National Park, but for our tour of the Bogong High Plains, we are going to be looking at the huts that were built and used by the farmers of the Kiewa Valley. The families that are featured here are the Riders, Edmondsons, Ropers and Wallaces. Other huts and other families are featured in our museum's exhibition. As far back as the 1880s, huts had been built on the Bogong High Plains to be used as shelter by cattlemen and women when taking their cattle up on the high plains for summer grazing. These families built their huts and yards in the areas that had been allocated on their leases, which ran for 100 years. The cattle would be walked up onto the high plains towards the end of spring and left to graze during the warmer summer months. The men and women from the Kiewa Valley who took their cattle up to the Bogong High Plains were pioneers of high plain grazing in a remote and thick bush. At first there were no roads, and they had to carry their supplies all by pack horse to their huts. These supplies would have to last for a 3-week stay, sometimes even longer, depending on how far their cattle had roamed. Already good horsemen and women, they soon learned an array of bush skills that were passed down from generation to generation, a tradition that would last for 123 years. Before the weather turned cold at the end of summer, the cattlemen would meet at the office in Tawonga, being the Bogong Hotel, and agree on a date that they would all head up to their high plain huts for the big muster. The cattle, after grazing on the high plains all summer, would then be brought back to their Kiewa Valley farms. The first hut built on the Bogong High Plains was Tawonga Hut, which got its name because the people that built it were from Tawonga. There have been a series of huts on this site from 1880 onwards. The first hut was originally built by John Ryder and his sons. Sid Ryder described it as shingle roof, snow gum walls, maybe a few slabs on the floor. The bloody thing lasted for 20 years and was burnt down, not fell down. The second hut, pictured here, was built in the early 1900s and was a bit better job but still pretty airy, so Sid said. Its end came 20 years later when a cow got stuck in it and half demolished the thing trying to get out. The third hut was a plain hut with an iron roof, built by Tawonga graziers in 1923. This sheltered cattlemen and women, skiers and bushwalkers for over 30 years. In 1973, Wally Ryder built 2 huts and a feed shed at Tawonga Hut site, being the 4th generation of huts built on this site. In 1988, Tawonga huts were classified by the Heritage Council of Victoria. Such is their historical significance to the cultural heritage of the Bogong High Plains and Victoria. The first Roper's hut was chosen below Horseshoe Bend on Frying Pan Spur, so it could be close to water. It's where Falls Creek is now. Fred Roper tells of how this hut was built. All we had was an axe, an adze, hammer wedge and a few nails. We never took any timber up with us, we just cut down woolly butt slabs and shingles. We had an old chap, Jack Platt, who could split shingles without any trouble. In 1930, Jack Roper's run was given over to the Kiewa Hydro Scheme, and he was given run 85 near Mount Nels. Jack Platt, aged 75, helped build this new hut, which took 10 days to build, not counting Sunday, a day which Jack Platt would not work. Sadly, the massive bushfires of 2003 burnt down this Roper's hut, but such is its historical and social significance, it has been replaced with a similar-looking hut with funding from Parks Victoria and the Victorian High Country Associations, all which have a vested interest in the huts of the High Plains. Jim Edmondson had run 31 when he took his cattle up from the Kiewa Valley onto the High Plains. In the early 1930s, he stayed in a tent on that site or at the nearby Fitzgerald's hut until he built his hut. He had pre-cut the timber on his property in Tawonga and had iron for the walls, chimney and roof, which were packed on a horse and taken up to the site. In 1974, the hut was given to the Victorian Education Department as no one in the Edmondsons family wanted to carry on with this tradition of taking cattle up to the high plains. Today, Edmondson's hut, which is still in good condition and along with a modern self-composting toilet, are opened all year round for walkers and skiers if they need shelter. The last hut we are going to look at on our tour of the huts of the Bogong High Plains is perhaps the most famous and certainly the most photographed of all the huts, Wallace's hut. The Wallace brothers from Kurgunya in the Kiewa Valley took 4 days to get their cattle up onto the high plains. Arthur, William and Stuart Wallace, along with Jack Platt, built their hut in 1889, which was very similar in construction to the second hut at the Tawonga hut site. It was built from split vertical snow gum sides, woolly but shingle roof and a large stone slab fireplace. This took about 6 weeks to build. The Wallaces gave up their run after 11 years and the hut was taken over by the then SEC and the shingle roof was covered with corrugated iron. In 1967, the National Trust gave Wallace's hut a Category C classification and in 1980 it was added to the Australian Heritage Register for its historical significance. These heritage listings ensure the conservation and preservation of the oldest surviving hut on the Bogong High Plains. We have toured some of the huts on the Bogong High Plains, but what do we know about this lovely park which these huts are built in? The Bogong High Plains is part of the Alpine National Park, which in turn is part of the Australian Alps National Park. The park is situated near Mount Beauty in northeast Victoria, covering 79,000 hectares, which stretches from Mount Bogong in the north to the Dargo River in the south, from the Mitter River in the east to Harryville in the west. It contains 9 of Victoria's highest peaks, including Mount Bogong and Mount Feathertop. It is the most extensive and spectacular scenery in all of the state, with subalpine woodlands, open areas, alpine ash and foothill forests. The rare mountain pygmy possum inhabits the areas around Mount Mackay and numerous other fauna and alpine plants are well represented. Today, many groups use the Alpine National Park for bushwalking, camping, skiing, or just to escape the summer heat in the Kiewa Valley. Parks Victoria now oversees the management of the Alpine National Park and promotes Wallace's Hut Heritage Trail. As the 100-year leases for the Kiewa Valley farmers' runs on the Bogong High Plains expired, the Victorian government decided they would not be renewed and the cattle were to be removed from the high plains to protect the alpine ecology. The cattlemen have said, "We care for the high country and would not do anything to harm it," and they also claim grazing had prevented bushfires. Despite their rugged appearance, the environment of the Australian Alps National Park is delicate and needs to be preserved, and has been included on the National Heritage List due to its natural, cultural and social significance to the nation. Even though the cattle do not roam on the Bogong High Plains anymore, the cattlemen and women and their huts have left us with a heritage that is part of the Australian identity, a heritage that has been mythologised by the likes of Banjo Paterson in his poem The Man from Snowy River, and romanticised in paintings by Eugene von Gerard, which displays the wild Australian bush, which was tamed by these bushmen. But the graziers of the Kiewa Valley are not myths, but real people who have forged an important part of Victoria and Australia's heritage. a heritage told through the history of the huts of the high plains, which should be preserved, along with the natural cultural landscape of the Bogong High Plains, which the huts have been built on.